The last lesson that we are covering is lesson 2.5, which is talking about proving angles that are congruent. And so we're going to be discussing different types of angles, and there are some definitions at the on page 96 in your textbook. So these are the definitions that you will be filling in your notes. So these are the things, everything else that was new and that is going to be pasted that is new in your notebook, I will already have filled in for you. But the definitions and the types of reasoning, the deductive and inductive reasoning, you need to fill those in your own notes. So the last definition that you're going to see on the first page of the chapter 2 vocab, which I believe begins on page 10, is vertical angles. It's down at the right side, the bottom column. So vertical angles are simply two angles whose sides form two pairs of opposite rays. So if you look at my example here that I have listed, you can see that right here in the middle is where they meet, and they are formed by a ray going this way and a ray going this way. Those are opposite rays. And then you can see that the same thing is true this way and this way. Those sides are made by doing opposite rays. So the sides are made by doing opposite rays. So this is an opposite ray of this. This is an opposite ray of this. So this and this are vertical angles. Now these two would also be vertical angles, but these two are just the ones we're focusing on. Well, what we know and what characteristic we understand to be true about vertical angles is that vertical angles are congruent. So the way that I recognize vertical angles is I look for an X. When I find an X, I look at the angles that are across from each other on that X. Those are vertical angles. So angle 1 and angle 2 are congruent to each other. Okay, and we're going to fill out some note cards here, or you're going to fill out, I'm going to already have them filled in, but you're going to see me fill in some note cards that are going to be on another page in our notes. But let's do the rest of the definitions first. So on page 11 are the rest of the definitions. The next definition is adjacent angles. Adjacent angles, when you hear adjacent, you should think of side by side. So the definition says adjacent angles are two angles with a common side, a common vertex, and no common interior points. So they're just two angles that are side by side. Angle 1 is side by side with angle 2. Okay? Now, adjacent angles might be congruent, but they might not be. And it's only going to be congruent if there's an angle bisector making the two angles congruent. Otherwise, if the ray does not bisect it evenly, one angle is going to be slightly bigger than the other. Okay? So angle 1 and angle 2 are what we call adjacent angles. And what we're going to talk about next, the next two, complementary angles and supplementary angles. Complementary angles and supplementary angles are just two special types of adjacent angles. Now, vertical angles are not adjacent. If you look at this picture, they are not side by side. They don't share a common side. Okay? Angle 1 would have to be here for them to be adjacent angles, or right here. Okay? Because they have to share a side. They don't share a side. Okay? Adjacent angles always share a side. So like this side right here is what angle 1 and angle 2 share. So that's what makes angle 1 and angle 2 adjacent angles. Now complementary angles are a special type of adjacent angles, and so are supplementary angles. And I have some silly tricks to help you memorize them. Okay? Complementary angles are two angles that add up to 90 degrees. Now, you don't have to be adjacent to be complementary. I could have this angle, and I could say, oh, that angle is 60 degrees. And then I could have another angle that's smaller, and I tell you that that's 30 degrees. Those are still complementary angles. They still add up to 90 degrees. They don't have to be adjacent, but oftentimes they are adjacent. Okay? They just simply are two angles that add up to 90 degrees. So what you're going to see is and you can see this right here, you can see an angle. Oops, let me lock that. You can see an angle that's a right angle inside of it. And then you're going to see another ray that cuts it into two smaller angles. And we've kind of already done this a little bit when we did the angle addition postulate in chapter 1. you already had to find some examples like this and find some missing angle measurements. Okay, so angle 1 here, let me draw it out a little bit bigger since you can't see it really well. This angle 1 and this angle 2, those are adjacent angles. And they're also complementary angles because they add up to 90. And I know they add up to 90 because there's a box that covers both of them. So that means this angle and this angle together make 90 degrees. Now I'm going to come back to the little characteristic in a minute because it's kind of silly, but it relates to supplementary. Okay, so let's talk about supplementary angles. Supplementary angles are two angles that add up to 180. Well, the only way to make that happen is there's got to be a straight angle, right? This right here is a straight angle. And then I have to take that straight angle and cut it into another angle. Okay? And now there's two angles there. But they still share the straight angle. Okay? And you already know that straight angles add up to 180. So that means that angle 1 here and angle 2 here, because they together form a straight angle, they add up to 180. So angle 1 plus angle 2 equals 180. Okay? Now, those terms can be somewhat, they're similar in vocabulary. And because they're similar, it's kind of hard for you to determine or keep straight which one is which. Okay? So this is just my little silly tricks. If you were in Bible times, okay, and one person was 90 and another person was 180, okay? You remember in Bible times people lived long, okay? It would be more of a compliment if someone looked at you and said, wow, you look like you are 90 instead of 180. That would be a compliment because you would be considered young, okay? But if someone said to you, man, you look like you're 180 years old, that's not really a compliment, okay? It's more of a compliment to say that you're only 90 than 180. The other way you can memorize it is that supplementary starts with the letters S-U-P, just like the word super. Supplementary. Super. So supplementary is super. Super is the bigger amount. Okay? Super means the greatest. So the 180 is associated with supplementary because supplementary starts like super. Okay? So it's greater or higher. Complementary, you can just remember it as it's a compliment if someone says that you're 90 instead of 180. I know it's kind of silly, but that's just a little couple of tricks I learned along the way. Okay? All right, now we're going to come back to theorem and paragraph proof at the end, okay? But I want to talk about those 4 major angles. There are going to be 2 pages, 1 page, in your notebook that you're going to get that looks like this, and it's going to give you all these theorems, which we're going to talk about theorems in a minute, associated with vertical angles, supplementary angles, and complementary angles. We'll talk more about these theorems in a few minutes, okay? But I want to talk about these cards, these note cards that are going to be inside this pocket when you get it, okay? These note cards are going to go into more detail about vertical angles, complementary angles, and supplementary angles. And on the back of the note cards, which I didn't take a picture of, but on the back, you're going to see what kinds of problems you're going to be expected to do with these, okay? So let's go ahead and let's pause there, and then the next video we'll go into more detail about these.